Just waiting to make sure we have a good connection here for the public. Okay, good evening, folks. My name is Andy Port. I'm the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Newburyport. Here with me this evening is obviously Mayor Holliday, Andy Egmont, Director of Youth Services, Mark Area, Sebastian Beleva, Kathleen Scanlon, and Mark Lindstrom. They are from Studio MLA, and they have done a feasibility study for us for the youth services program for the city. They have looked at both the Brown School and a property on Low Street that the city is looking to acquire to look at options for us to determine what options we would have, what the cost might be for those different scenarios. Our office gets involved sometimes with these capital projects and looking at feasibility studies and what the options are. So we helped out with this particular project, coordinating with the mayor's office and youth services throughout the process. I'm here in the background, but I'm going to hand over the introduction to the mayor, and then we'll have Studio MLA give a presentation of the slides that you'll see this evening.
Thank you, Andy. Appreciate it. And thank you to all who are here for this presentation tonight. Before we start, I just wanted to bring the community together in terms of where we are. As you know, Youth Services has been at the Brown School site for many years since we sold the Kelly School and turned that over to private development. We are looking to try and do some type of housing on the upper floors of the Brown School. And then it became a question on whether or not Youth Services stays at the Brown School or moves to another site. So, you know, throughout this process, I have to give a lot of credit to all Andy Egmont and her staff who, you know, when I started as mayor 11 years ago, they were working out of a small office and doing activities in the auditorium. Then they moved to the Kelly School and they could only use the first floor, and they made that work. Then we moved them out of the Kelly School over to the Brown School. And, you know, through all their creativity and painting and making the site work, they, you know, really took a very old school and turned it into, you know, a site that, you know, has, you know, they made it work. And that's what Andy Egmont and her staff do all the time. So our goal was to try and figure out what made the most sense for the future of youth services. Now, I started driving around the city and talking to Andy and other people. And then one day on Low Street, I thought about the Low Street site that had been informally used as emergency ops. But then we had a leaky roof in the building and, you know, could not continue operating out of there. The building was owned by the National Guard. I reached out to the National Guard and asked them if there would be any interest in selling that as surplus property to the city. That was 3.5 years ago, and we began a very, very long and difficult process with the state to acquire the property. And so as we are winding down in terms of our timeline at the end of this calendar year for the city to purchase this property, a little over 2 acres for $220,000. It's really an incredible deal with what property is going for in the city. And so at that point, it made sense to put out an RFP so that we could begin to get a true sense of what the needs at both of these sites were. I will come back at the end of this process and talk a little bit more about where we are in that process, but I think we picked a really good team, Studio MLA Architects, and they have been responsive, and, you know, we've asked them to go back and, you know, could you redo some of your projections for the Brown School? Could you do this? And, you know, they worked with our team that we put together, and this is their presentation for the community tonight about their findings at both the Brown School and at the site on Low Street. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Sebastian, who's going to introduce the team from Studio MLA. And welcome, and look forward to your presentation again.
Thank you, Mayor Holliday. So this is Mike Lindstrom. I'm actually going to jump in ahead of Sebastian.
Oh, sorry, Mike. Yeah, so Mike Lindstrom is going to take over at this point. Sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
So I'm Mike Lindstrom from Studio MLA Architects. We're located in Brookline, Massachusetts. And a lot of our practice is working with communities on community centers, youth centers, educational facilities. We have with us tonight Sebastian, Mark Urea, and Kathleen Scanlon, who have been sort of the core team working on this project. I would just say, as I said, so we've done a lot of these projects, and one of the things that is just super impressive about working here at Newburyport is what a great job Andy Eggman and her team have done under difficult physical circumstances. I mean, I think we're always inspired to see what programs can do, and what we see is the opportunities they would have in a center that was really designed and built to support the kinds of programs that they're doing. And all of the Newburyport team, both the city and the youth services, have just been really great to work with, very open and very inclusive in terms of bringing in the community into the process. It's interesting because this is really the one project that we've been working on sort of throughout the pandemic. So this has sort of been our pandemic project from start to finish. And obviously, we know that the city's faced a lot of challenges. Everybody's been having to kind of reinvent the way they work. But we've been just really pleased with the process. So what we were asked to do with the study, there were really several components to it. The first was to take a really hard look at the physical assets, right? At the Brown School itself, at the Brown School site, at the Low Street site, and the existing building on the Low Street site. We came in with a team of engineers, code consultants, cost estimator, and really dug into what's there now, what the deferred maintenance looks like on the buildings, what the opportunities and challenges are with each site. The second thing we were asked to do is really try to understand Newburyport Youth Services and what their needs were, and what they're doing now, what they'd like to be doing. And we'll talk a little bit about that process, which was really interesting, and I think informed a lot of what we did. Then based on that, we were asked to sort of take an idealized, I won't say wish list, but sort of a realistic wish list case for space for Newburyport Youth Services and test it out on the two sites. And just kind of come back with our apple to apple, feedback. It's not easy to compare two very different sites, but we've done our best to provide what we think is a really good options for each. Obviously, we're working without really a budget, without a timeline, but trying to do something that was reasonable and that put an equal amount of sort of effort into the two sites so that the city and the community could make an informed judgment in terms of evaluating the two sites. So I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen to talk a little bit more about the process at this point.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Mike. My name is Kathleen Scanlon, and my role for this feasibility study was the project manager. And I'll be giving an overview, discussing, a little bit more about the process that we used for the project, and then Sebastian and Mark will delve further into each section. So we were engaged by the Newburyport planning director back in March, as Mike mentioned. And our goal was really to organize the process to identify a best option for each of the two sites, 57 Low Street and the former Brown School. I'm going to have you go to the next slides, Sebastian, and I'm going to give a little bit of information about our firm. Sebastian, are you controlling the slides, or Andy Port?
I am.
Okay.
You guys are in a lot of order. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so can you go to the next slide?
This one?
We're not seeing a change yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're able to advance.
What slide are you seeing? Should be
The
the
introduction and overview and process slide with the logos.
Hold on.
Mike, do you want to give a little information about our firm while you're?
Is that updated?
Yes.
We can see the slide of our firm, yeah. So there's 20 people at Studio MLA. We do in-house landscape architecture, interior design, and architecture. And as I said, we focus on educational, youth, and recreational facilities. And so this is, the kind of project we really relish. We like doing it. We also do a lot of adaptive reuse. So thinking about the possibilities in old buildings is something we really like to do.
Okay, next slide, Sebastian. Great. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly talk about the timeline here. As Mike mentioned, we started back in March. We had our kickoff meeting just as the pandemic was unfolding. We conducted project kickoff, and then right away started organizing focus groups and an online survey. In March and April, we conducted actual in-person consultant site visits, which were our first experiment in social distancing, I think, for many of us, where we had our engineers come out to the building. And while they were conducting that and recording their observations, we formulated an online survey with the community and had those responses and feedback back to us by May 6th. And then in May, a week later, we attended the Affordable Housing Trust public meeting in Newburyport. And in that same time, started conducting focus groups also online, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in the next coming slides. And then following that, we did some concept development. We came up with some preliminary options and then did some revisions and cost estimating in order to present them to a selected facility committee. And after doing some revisions and representing, we were able to produce the final draft of this presentation and report and present it to the city. So all that wrapped up, where you see us now. And really our main goal, though, was to provide Newburyport with tools and objective analysis to help evaluate both sites to make the best decision on how to provide a long-term home for the Newburyport Youth Services Department and its programs. And all of this work has been captured in a report that we submitted to the city of Newburyport. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. So as Kathleen mentioned, this kind of process began with the on-site documentation, investigation, as well as the community engagement portion of this. This was an opportunity to hear from the users and staff of the youth services, as well as the larger community. We had almost 200 participants for the survey, which we felt was a really good showing. As you can see, it was mostly about 50% parents and guardians, but we had a pretty good youth response as well, which we were very pleased about. And this survey ranged from a number of different types of questions, multiple choice. There were some pick your favorite images and some free answer type questions, an example of which is here. What describes the future vision for the outdoor space at youth services. And you can see here answers range from a safe place to let off steam, flexible space, this access and exploration of nature, and a place to create opportunities. Overall, participants were most interested to see things like a gym, a game room, a lounge, place to do homework. A makerspace was a big item. They were also interested to see things like music studio, performance spaces, a teaching kitchen, and kind of group meeting spaces. Some things they were less likely to be interested in were like a yoga and dance studio, video game rooms, photography studio. But overall, youth gravitated towards areas of like seating and hanging out, while parents preferred more they had a place to learn and experience new things. We also held 3 focus groups involving parents, guardians, staff, and some select youth from the program. And this was more of a chance to get some more developed answers from these groups. There was a drawing exercise, you know, asking questions of places that you want to be, that you could be relaxed, that things you would want to learn. And these types of things help people think outside the box a little bit and give us answers they wouldn't normally give more straightforwardly. We had some breakout groups and ultimately a presentation of what people were interested in. All of these responses really helped to shape the architectural program and some of the organizational things that you'll see a little later in the presentation. Site investigations were conducted by our team at MLA, as well as some of our project consultants, GGD Engineering, WV Engineers, Foley, Buell Roberts, and PMC. They've contributed greatly to this project, and we just want to give them a little acknowledgement. So as we mentioned, there's 2 sites that we investigated. The first site that we looked at is the existing Brown School at 42 Milk Street. You know, it's an urban site, different from that of Low Street. It's about a little over 1.25 acres. The original construction back in 1922. There's also some additions of note. The gymnasium addition in the 70s, as well as a 3-story addition in the front of the existing school in 1975. This kind of plays into some of the constraints we look at in terms of reorganizing that we get into a little later. So as I mentioned, it is an urban site. There's an existing play space outside. Excuse me. But ultimately, you know, this was a building that was designed for another use. A lot of the systems in the building are old and starting to fail in need of repair. The ground floor of this building looks a little something like this, and this is mainly occupied by the youth services program. And you can see here how it's kind of a little disjointed and scattered throughout the building, offices and different spaces used by the program. On the upper floors, which were also looked at during this process, but are kind of out of the scope of the youth services. So we looked at that. Those are mostly classroom spaces, which, as the mayor mentioned, is being looked at for a future residential development. Overall look at what the Brown School is now. The quality of the spaces and efficiency of use varies throughout the building. These are some of the classroom spaces. You can see in the lower corner, the big ramp in the building. This is kind of representative of the different construction errors of the building and how it's connected throughout. But there's other areas of the building that you see here that are primarily interior spaces. There's no access to natural light. This game room and some of the meeting spaces are kind of fit into undersized areas. You know, looking at some of the administrative and office spaces and, you know, the amenities for them as well. You know, so there's definitely room for improvement there. And now looking at kind of the back wing of the building where the gymnasium addition is, you know, the gymnasium itself is more of a cafetorium, as we've been calling it. It was, you know, it's not a regulation size court, but it does have the stage, and behind it is a locker room, which is currently being used mostly for storage. You can also see there is an existing kitchen in the building, but you definitely need some updates to that as well. You know, a building of this age is going to see some issues here. We're highlighting a number of water and envelope issues. There's some roof drainage. problems on the addition. And these are all things that we've identified throughout our investigation and are looking towards, remedying for any future use of the building. Here we're looking at more code related and egress issues with the bathrooms and the stairs. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see the 3 stairs heading up to an exterior door, and like that is not an accessible egress. So things like that throughout the building need to be looked at and addressed to make this user-friendly for everyone. And then, as I mentioned before, the building systems, the HVAC system, plumbing, electrical systems are all outdated and in need of repair, some very extensively. So, and these are things that would need to be done for any future use of the building, and are definitely a focus when we're looking at any future options for this site. So some of the takeaways here, a thoughtful reorganization of the architectural layout on the ground floor could do a lot to helping make the building more function more efficiently, as well as updating the finishes, some of the cosmetic elements of the building to make it a more lively place. I mentioned the extensive code upgrades for the egress and restroom accessibilities. The building envelope, as I mentioned, also needs repairs, general waterproofing, window replacements, the systems upgrades and significant replacement of some of those systems, as well as fire and sprinkler services as well are needed in the building. And these all come directly from our consultants' analysis of the building. Shifting focus to the other site, which is 57 Low Street. This is a very different site. It's much more open. It's a little over 2 acres. The building in question, which is it was a former garage and then emergency service office. That was built in 1998. But some other notable elements on site include the historic Powder House, built in 1822, the adjacent National Guard building, as well as the Knox School directly across the street. A unique element for this site is the wetlands towards the rear of the site, and that's identified on this diagram here, and becomes a major goal in looking at any options for this site, trying to have as little impact on the wetlands and the natural elements of this site as possible. As you can see here, the historic Powder House in the background, and that this was originally a 3-bay garage. The building is still about 50% garage and office space, as we mentioned. But a good chunk of the building is uninsulated, and it's significantly smaller than the current space being used by the youth services. So an expansion would be required as well. But there are some strengths here as well with the open space and access to nature, as were mentioned as highlights in some of the surveys. So, overall, as it's currently being used, the building is in fair shape, but if it was repurposed, would require a lot of upgrades to the building envelope and an expansion of the building physically, as well as the systems, prepping for those types of connections. And we've also looked at possibilities of, is this building worth saving in this scenario, in certain scenarios? And we've looked at reusing the building as well. So that's something we get into a little bit further down the line. Now we'll talk about some of the design concepts and how these concepts developed over time. And this really begins with identifying what is the current need for space for the youth services. And these numbers here were developed from a combination of taking the existing youth services spaces, the comments from the community engagement, just standards and as well as a number of unfulfilled needs for space and program space throughout this process. You can see here that this tally adds up to just over 15,000 square feet. The current youth services space at the Brown School occupies slightly more than that, just about 1,000 more square feet. So it's possible, but there's, this has to also do with the way things are organized and laid out within the spaces that they're given. These numbers break down a little further to kind of show what types of spaces we're talking about. NYS spaces include the art room, the preschool and game room, things like that. The administration is particularly offices. Common spaces include the entry, lobby, public restrooms, some of the mechanical and storage spaces, as well as a cafe snack bar. And then the largest program element is the gymnasium. I just want to take a moment to explain the difference when we say program and architectural program. The architectural program is referring to these spaces, the spaces themselves. So like the art room program is a program element, the preschool is a program element. But that is different than when we're referring to the youth services program, just to clarify so that doesn't get confusing as we talk about a lot of program. This is a diagram that we've developed as a tool for this project. And really what it is it represents all of those spaces that we just discussed. And it's organized in a way that we feel operates most effectively and efficiently. This is an organizational tool for organizing the spaces, as well as how they can be applied to each of these sites. It describes both physical and visual relationships between these spaces. And you can see that it's organized around a central core or main street of public spaces, entering through the lobby into the cafe, public restrooms, gallery type space. Just off of the main entrance is the administration and office space, which provides increased safety and opportunity to keep eyes on who's entering and leaving the building. Other spaces branching off of this common space core include the gymnasium on one end and the youth services rooms to the other. And what this does is really allow for flexibility of use within the building. Sections of the building can then be turned on and off depending on who's using it. And this might be at different times of the week, year, or day. And this really positions a facility to be more of a community asset. Flexibility equals more value. So this is seen here. If you're looking at a weekday use, this would be a youth services use. Most of the areas of the building are turned on, they're being used. But if you went to a weekend or an evening off hours use, perhaps spaces like the cafe or the maker space are being rented out, the gymnasium for community programs. So then areas like the administration can be shut off and don't have to be accessed, as well as some of the other places of the building that we don't want to give public access to. Even further, for an event like a sporting event or even a voting or other community event, just the gymnasium can be accessed in some of the public spaces, but primarily most of the building would be inaccessible to the public. And there's just different ways that we're exploring for possibilities for the facility to be used. I'm going to turn it over to Mark now to start talking through some of the opportunities and design concepts for the Brown School site.
Sebastian, this is Mike. I'm just going to jump in for a second just to sort of bridge from the program and the bubble diagrams to the design concepts, just to remind everybody that what our task was to take, what's the best way to organize the youth services facility, and then test it out on the two sites and see what the best design was for each of the two sites. Understanding that we're never going to get it's never going to look just like the bubble diagram, and it's going to look very different putting it into an existing building than it does on an open site. Thanks.
So thanks, Mike. Speaking of sites, and this is Mark, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for showing up and being with us tonight. So I wanted to take the group through some of our thoughts on the Brown School site specifically. So what we're looking at here is a simplified version of sort of stripped back way of looking at the neighborhood. And even at this level, we can tell that what we're dealing with is a historic neighborhood, very tight-knit community with a certain scale and a certain feeling and a certain, certain density that we have to respect with any of our options going forward. So, and if you'll excuse me for just a second. So starting from here, we can zoom in just a little bit, and on the next slide, let's start to concentrate specifically on the Brown School itself. So Sebastian had alluded to this earlier. What we're looking at here is a diagram essentially of what it means to us when we're looking at a building that's been added on to over the years like this. So what we have left are things that we can't move and we have to work around. In this case, it's existing elevators, stairs, and structural walls that are really integral to making sure that the building is viable long term. And then when we move on to looking at what it would take on the next slide to have a residential use on the upper floor, we see that now when we're considering that, there have been some slight changes from the previous slide. We have to give up some space to that residential portion so that they can have a lobby on the ground floor and a presence. What we're probably going to be looking at and what we should be ready for is they're probably going to need a new elevator cord. The existing one very likely won't be able to service a condo use or a residential use. And they're going to need another stair so that they can egress out of the building so that we can make sure that everybody is safe. So when we start to look at this, what we start to realize is that we have these series of, we've been calling them gremlins. These are things that aren't immediately apparent, but as you dig further and further into it, you discover that there are things that we need to be ready for. There are things that we need to consider that don't jump out at you immediately. These are things that gremlins aren't visible from 30,000 feet. They don't jump out at you until you start actually walking through the building. So if we go to flipping to the next slide, considering everything that we know about the site, we started to test out some options that we could look at with the group. And before we move on from this slide, we worked very closely with the NYS and the client group overall to make sure that we all understood what we were proposing here and that we narrowed them down together as a group. So very quickly glossing over them, there's the about face option. And this one, these are essentially ways for us to ask questions. So that what this one asks is, well, what if we were to take down the existing gym, build a connector of common spaces, and then we had the opportunity to build a new gym? So what the answer to this question is that, well, we get pretty close to the property lines. We're starting to deal with volumes that are a little bit too big for the neighborhood. So then we would think like, well, we know that the Brown School, it's being considered for another use. What if we tried to fit in the NYS program on the site? So to do that, to answer that question, we have to go to, say, a 2-story option, which turns out to be cost prohibitive, and it has the same problems as the earlier option where we get just too close, too big, too tight, especially for this neighborhood where we want to be respectful. So if we move on to so the key takeaways from this, we're trying to we're trying to address the best value of the construction dollars, protect the investment of the original building, and most importantly, prevent further degradation of this facility so that we can kind of stabilize it and make sure that it's not going to be leaking anymore, that it's going to be warm, and that it's going to be habitable. So to that end, what we want to do is make sure that we're ensuring the weather tightness, functionality, and enhanced safety of the building. And enhanced safety is things like sprinklers or even the ADA upgrades that Sebastian was alluding to. We're intending on only minor upgrades to finishes, and this is what I'm reading off right now is sort of our baseline amount of work that we are considering for the Brown School. So we're calling this the option one, the minimal intervention. We also know that the systems need to be replaced. I think that we had, building on what Sebastian was saying before, these are old systems. It's been a while since they've been maintained, and they've reached the end of their useful life. So one thing that we also should be aware of is that in a building of this age, there is the possibility of mold and other hazardous materials, and that remediation would be something that is outside of our feasibility scope for now, and it's something the city would need to address. So working with the group, we decided that staying within the bounds of the existing building was probably our best bet. So this is a simple block layout that shows what we think that we can do, and what really is the best bang for the buck, especially in this building, which is beautiful. It has a lot of great character, a lot of great bones, and it's been a fixture of the community for a very long time. So what we found is that we can still approximate what we think is the best way for this project to operate. We can still maintain a common spaces spine that would feed into the gym and the NYS program and still have it be overlooked by the administration. Now, there are some, we never want to say difficulties, we always want to say opportunities. So there are a lot of these opportunities that we're seeing here, like we have to work around those existing walls that we know we can't move. And we're also constrained by just how big the original building is. So with this, the reconfigured concept, which is our option 2, if we start to think about not just what the minimal is, but what's really going to be necessary for NYS to really continue to grow and thrive here, what we do is, we look at we took a schematic look at what the possible organization is, which is what we're looking at here. We would, at least at this stage, think that relocating the main entrance to Lime Street would be a good way of reorienting the uses of the building. And we would maintain the existing gymnasium. All right, thank you very much.
For Low Street, it's a little bit of a different situation, whereas at Brown School, we're kind of fitting that, we're trying to see how that architectural program diagram best fits within the existing constraints of the Brown School. At the Low Street site, we have the opportunity to think outside of the existing building because of its current size. And we explored, as I mentioned before, options that involved keeping the existing building on site and expanding, and then options that got rid of that building and kind of started with a fresh, from a fresh approach. You can see in both of these attempts and first early concepts how that diagram is being applied, with the common spaces being like the hub of the building, with administration just off of the entrance, and then the other spaces branching off from there. Some of the things we found with the early concepts, particularly in keeping the existing building, is most of the program was in the middle of the site, or the gymnasium ended up towards the rear of the site, which, as I mentioned before, was something we were trying to avoid in having as little impact on the wetlands as possible. So ultimately, we found a compromise, again, getting rid of the existing building here allows us to organize a facility that most closely represents that ideal organization in the diagram, the connections visually and physically. This option here, this staggered concept, you can see, excuse me, have a parking lot up front, enter through the central core, having little impact on the wetlands itself, as you can see in this diagram here with the wetland limit. Also, we've designed the space in a way where the cafe actually is at the kind of culmination of these common spaces at the end, which kind of turns to have this specific view towards the historic Powder House. So we're looking at options with this site in the way the building is organized to really address some of the challenges on site, but also turn them and make them opportunities. So as Mark mentioned, these were concepts that we worked with the facility committee throughout the summer in kind of tweaking and developing these down to the three options that we had just mentioned. The first of which being the minimal intervention at Brown School. And just like Mark said, this is a look at what is the minimum amount of work that really needs to be done to prevent further degradation of the building. It brings it up to code, so it'll be accessible and inclusive. Minor upgrades to the cosmetic finishes. So this includes things like paint, flooring, and ceilings, but in a as needed basis. With the upgrades to the building systems and the envelope of the building, it starts to prepare for the future development on the upper levels. As we mentioned, there is a project in the future that they're looking at, and I think there's opportunities to kind of share some of these repairs to the building as a possibility, and that we talk about that a little bit further. But it extends the Newburyport Youth Services ability to stay at the Brown School, but it's not a permanent solution for youth services. So that's something to keep in mind with option one. Option two here is a conceptual rendering from the Lime Street, kind of the corner of Milk and Lime Street, looking at that new entrance that Mark mentioned. And this is just kind of to get an idea of, it's a new face of the facility and the program. This option takes into consideration all of the items in option one and goes a little bit further. So it prevents the further degradation of the building, extends the useful life, has all the code and accessibility upgrades. The new Lime Street entrance is a welcoming face to the community. We strive to improve the spatial organization of the youth services within the building, increasing functionality and safety. There would be more cosmetic upgrades, really kind of giving a fresh look to the youth services program spaces. And this option, like I said, goes further to provide a long-term home for the youth services at the Brown School.
If I could add something very quickly, that option two for the Brown School, one of the key differences here is that we're adding in the possibility of reconfiguring the interior. With option one, it is purely just changing out materials, not moving walls.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Now for option three, on the Low Street site, again, a conceptual rendering kind of showing what could be. Again, just, in the background, you can see there that the visual relationship to the Powder House, accessible parking, and accessible building. This allows for the optimal spatial organization of the layout. The site itself maximizes outdoor opportunities and access to nature and historical resources. It's an investment in a permanent home for the youth services, and it's a building specifically designed to meet their needs. It's a fresh approach to the facility. It'll be a vibrant and enriching environment. And as I mentioned before, the building itself, designed for flexible uses, it becomes an asset and a resource for the entire community. So now let's talk about the cost breakdown. And throughout this process, we worked with the cost estimator to develop a preliminary cost estimate. And this estimate is really looking at, it's a conservative view of what a project like this could cost from a schematic level. You keep in mind that these costs are subject to change based on the market. But right now, what we're looking at is each column represents an option 1, 2, or 3. And they're an order of magnitude of the total cost for construction. There are additional costs for a project like this, so it's important to keep in mind. But really what you're seeing here is how each of these options stack up against one another and some of the pieces that are involved in the cost. So things like the estimating contingency, project management, construction contingency. These are things that are all part of all construction projects. But one thing to note here is that these contingencies for the Low Street site as a new build are less than a renovation project that would be at the Brown School, as Mark mentioned, those gremlins. So, so there's a little bit extra padding to consider that things might pop up that you don't know until the project starts. Breaking it down. So if you look at this, this is for option 1, the minimal renovation or intervention, to the Brown School. It's broken up into 2 sections here. And this 3.5 million number here is only specifically dealing with deferred maintenance of the building. So that's looking at, as we mentioned, some of like the envelope issues, complete replacement of the HVAC system, and things that need to be done for this building to be up to code and usable. The second half of the column goes a little further to include some of those minor upgrades that we talked about, mostly cosmetic but no reorganization of the buildings. So that's something to keep in mind. Looking at the second option for the Brown School, the column's a little bit bigger. It's a slightly larger project. But as we mentioned, it encompasses all of the needs for the Brown School site, looking at the reorganizing of the youth services spaces to be most efficient, and take care of all the cosmetic upgrades and site upgrades as well that really make this a home. For the Low Street site, you can see the number dropped a little bit, and that goes into some of the advantages of building new. One opportunity for the Low Street site is phasing of the project. We could look at opportunities here for the gymnasium to be phase 2 build for the project, if that were advantageous for the project to go forward.
Or if someone wants to write a nice big check, we name it after them.
Exactly, some naming rights or something along those lines. So there are some things that can be done for the site, possibly. So this kind of shows, the comparison between the 3 options and what some potential cost implications might be. Again, keep in mind option one, things that aren't included are, there's a complete HVAC replacement, but other systems are repair as needed. The same goes for the exterior work, overall repair work, no reconfiguration, things like that. So it's just important to keep in mind when we're talking about these numbers. Another thing to consider too is for both Brown School options, no matter what happens at the site, it is going to be a smaller available footprint for the youth services because they would be giving up some additional ground floor space to the future development above. So this is just a recap of the three options and the opportunities and advantages for each site, along with the cost as estimated. And so that kind of concludes our analysis. And
Sebastian, I'm just going to jump in as you hand the screen back to Andy and just thank everybody for attending. And I hope this presentation was useful. I know that the report that some of you may have seen is a pretty thick book, and it's a little bit complex. And for people who aren't used to reading it, it may be a little bit hard to make your way through. But hopefully, we made some really clear points with this. I'd say one of those is that the Low Street site, seems to be a really good investment for the city, and whatever you do with it, I think at the very least, this study has shown us that from a development perspective, you can definitely build some very useful space on what is a nice site with zero impact to the wetlands, without touching the wetlands. I think the second thing that's important to know is that the Brown School could provide a really great home for youth services. But I think there's kind of smart strategies to doing the work on the Brown School. And what comes out of it for us is that there needs to be sort of a holistic approach to the building, which number one, takes care of the deferred maintenance. And number two, I think tries to get its arms around what's going to happen to the whole building so that the overall costs of just repairing the infrastructure and making sure that the building is sound can be properly shared across whatever different projects are going to happen there. And then I think there's a lot of creative ways to make this work. I would also say that from a cost estimating standpoint, our estimator was using the best information available across the two sites. It's a very kind of volatile construction market right now. And obviously we were looking at, as I said, sort of trying to fit in an ideal space for youth services. So there would certainly be ways to dial it back in any of these cases. So I hope that was helpful, and we'll hand it back to Andy.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Kathleen. We appreciate the work that you all did on this study here. Obviously, the intent here with this project is to try to make sure that the youth services program in the future has a facility that meets its needs, regardless of where it's located. And this, obviously, the study here gives us the information, the overall idea of what the concept would be, what the cost of the order of magnitude for the cost might be at the different sites and different options we have. Obviously, there's different variations that could be taken out of any one of these, but it gives us an idea about, as we think about as city officials, try to think about what's the permanent home for youth services. They have, as the mayor, I think, mentioned earlier on, they've been bounced around a couple of times over the years to different municipal facilities, but to sort of ensure that they have a permanent home that meets their needs and is in good condition. So I think also the study also helps us to get a better idea of some of the issues that the Brown School has, for instance, and even as the city looks to acquire the Low Street property, what potential that has for the city moving forward. So I wanted to thank you for your work there. We do want to allow the opportunity for public comment. So I just throw up on the screen for folks just the instructions for that. If you are interested in speaking and expressing any comments or concerns and so forth, if you could use the raise hand feature that's in Zoom and just press that little button at the bottom of your screen. What we'll do is we'll allow each person in turn to provide comments to the group. If you have questions, We can circle back as needed with responses, but most important to us is having public input on this sort of thing, because obviously this information will be used by the mayor and the city council, NYS and others, including our department, to the extent we're involved with any capital projects. We'd like to hear what folks might have to say to add to tonight's discussion. So with that, I'll kind of go through the cycle of who's raised their hands. So it looks like the first person we have that's raised their hand is Jonathan Nickerson. And just a reminder for both Jonathan and anyone else, I'll unmute you individually and you'll have to unmute on your end as well. So Jonathan, would you like to comment?
Hi, actually, this is Ryan Nickerson. My husband's right here. We're underneath his account. We're at 354 High Street. I just wanted to kind of thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to look at the different options and talking through. And I just kind of walk through a couple of the pieces in my mind that this is really impactful to me. I have a 2-year-old who's actually trying to get me to come downstairs right now, and a 5-year-old at the Bresnahan. So I'm gonna just say that most people that I speak with about this already think it's a done deal. So they assume that we're going to be moving to a larger, newer space. So the fact that we're still having this conversation is not really known by the public, because we had voted on it, we had spoken about it. That's kind of a big deal. I've also noticed, I've spoken with my parents, my friends, my family about this, and the Brown School in general. When you talk about some of the pieces that haven't been factored into the how much it's going to cost, mold and hazardous materials remediation is not even counted in. So we're talking about asbestos. Like, if you've been in there, you've gone to a basketball, there's no place to sit. Everything needs to be updated. So it just, I guess, at the long and the short of it, this is a really short-sighted view. I think that we need to purchase Low Street. It's across the street from the middle school. So, from a mom's perspective, somebody who would be using it, you want to have access to it. Right now, the Brown School is nowhere near downtown. It's nowhere near the schools. And how our kids are expected to get there? The reality is unless their parents are driving them, they can't get there. And parents that are working or low income kids, that just doesn't make sense. I just also think, if I was thinking of the Brown School and then thinking of the other properties that have been purchased and updated in the last few years, if you're going to be purchasing a multi-million-dollar place, you're not necessarily going to want to be above a youth services. We've already had issues with parking there. I've gone there many times for music classes, and I park in front of people's houses, and everyone's wonderful. It's part of the community, but there's no parking. There's the spaces does not make sense inside. As the individuals who have talked about the study have spoken, like, it's been added on. It was done in 1920 when, 22, when the needs for the schools were much different. So, I just think that, I know folks have talked about the critical upgrades. Again, those are not included. So, like, this isn't, when I was looking at the money, like, it's not an apples to apples comparison. And I understand that these are unprecedented times, but, if we don't go with buying a new property, those properties are not going to exist in 5 years when folks and city council people who are thinking that, you're going to be able to buy something in 5 years. Where is youth services? Because I know that I moved into Newburyport expecting this. You have more and more young families moving in with the expectation that there is a support system for our youth. And, you know, that's something that we are being held accountable to. You know, this is a great opportunity for us, and to think that we would be able to just update something that, again, there's asbestos, like, it's gross. It's a gross space. And thinking that all we can do is just slap some, you know, lipstick on a pig is not going to fly for taxpayers in this city. I think that's a really big piece. So if, you know, as we talk about money and the short-term, long-term investment in our city, putting in, you know, $3 or $4 million for not touching on mold once they open up those walls, it's going to be a disaster. And then having passed on buying new space, you know, that's something to think about. I would also say, you know, I think we, again, need to purchase Low Street. And I had heard wind that there would be a line item saying that NYS should not be part of the Low Street purchase. So if you do purchase it, NYS should definitely be a part of the conversation. They should not be left out of the conversation if it was just going to go to wetland conservation efforts. So that's kind of what I have to say.
Okay, thank you. The next person we have is Sheila Spalding.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, my internet connection is unstable, so I was just checking. I'm here to voice my support for the purchase of the Low Street property. I concur with a lot of the statements that Ryan just made. I think that location is more accessible and it's just more practical to use that building. I also have concerns with the unknown costs of remediating for mold. Excuse me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next person we have is Judy Timon.
Hi, I have two questions. One has to do with the wetlands delineation at the Low Street site. Does anyone know when the latest wetlands delineation was done, including, of course, the parcel itself and any surrounding parcels? And my second question is more general in nature. Does Newburyport Youth Services currently serve households other than those that are in Newburyport? Thank you.
I'll leave the second question to Andy Egmont, but this is Andy Port. Thank you, Judy. The first question about the wetlands delineation, we had that commissioned as part of the feasibility study. So that was done in 2019. We had the A&R plan and the wetlands delineation done. So that's relatively recent. And we're happy to provide more information about that. It is posted on the city's website, but we can elaborate with more information. But that wetlands delineation is relatively recent. Andy Egmont, do you want to speak to the second question?
I'm happy to. Judy, currently Youth Services does offer some regional. There's two pieces that we do. So we have registrations open to non-residents. They pay an additional fee. About 10% of our registrations are non-residents. They are made up primarily of families that go to school in our city, or people who work in the city who sign their children up for the program. The other piece that we do is we oversee a regional grant for positive youth development and substance abuse prevention. So we also work regionally within that.
Thank you, Andy. The next person we have is Eliza. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name incorrectly, but Eliza Bobeck. Bobeck.
Hi, Bobek. That's great. Good try. It's a weird name. I wanted to comment on a few things. My family lives very close to the Brown School site on Prospect Street. And so we are neighbors. We may have been in some of those diagrams that you showed. I have two children who have attended many programs with Newburyport Youth Services after school, during the summer, parent programs, et cetera. And I really credit with Youth Services with helping us feel connected to this community since we moved here about 7 years ago. My daughter, who's 10 years old, said, well, if Youth Services moves, I won't be able to walk over there. And I got into a great conversation with her about the things that can happen at Newburyport Youth Services and what our other options are. And I think that I feel very strongly that there is a need to serve the entire community and that we need to take a long-term, long view look at this project. I think that seeing all of the detailed, well-informed proposals this evening, I think if we do not have the opportunity to move to the site on Low Street, we will regret it. I think it provides the best options that we see fit. And it's frankly very exciting to think about giving Youth Services the space to continue their great and important work. So I am just here to comment on my support of that site. I guess the last thing that I would say is, I'm a parent, but I'm also someone that works with schools and communities as part of my day job, and I have for almost 20 years. And I know how strong community services and youth services, how important they are to strengthen communities and families' connections to the communities in which they live. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eliza. Alana Porter, you're the next speaker. Alana, you'll want to unmute on your end as well.
Andy, I don't believe she had her hand up. I think it's just alphabetical.
Sorry, it was up a moment ago. Maybe I'm missing something. Okay. It looks like that's the last person we have that's raised their hand. If that's the case, then we do have one other person, Jane Snow.
Thank you, Andy. Jane Snow, 9 Coffin Street. Am I correct that when we look at the figure for Low Street of the 8 million, that does not include the price of purchasing the land?
That is correct. That's a separate cost or transaction.
Okay, thanks, Andy.
We do have another hand raised, Kristen Benito.
Hi there. Yes, my name is Kristen Benito. I have a 4-year-old and 2-year-old little girl and a baby on the way. I am in support of the Low Street location as well. We've been to the Brown Street location. It's definitely been a great location that we've had so far, but in seeing what is possible with Low Street, I think that is where I would want my children to be going and taking part in activities besides being in a building with covered up asbestos, etc. So my support is just towards the Low Street location. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Are there any other folks here this evening who'd like to comment? And I see Ellie Baker.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Andy, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Andy. So I also wanted to just voice my support for the Low Street property and for purchasing that, and kind of echo what others have said about sort of not missing the boat with the opportunity there to purchase that property. And I apologize if I missed this in the presentation, but I'm wondering, Andy, if somebody can comment on what happens if the city does not purchase that property? What is sort of the next step for that property so that we can understand what else would happen there perhaps? Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. Well, this is Andy, this is planning director. From what I know, the city has had an arrangement to date, informally, to use a portion of the building anyway, and that property that's to be acquired for storage for the city's emergency management operations some years ago. Right now, it's primarily used for storage, but we don't know whether the National Guard would continue that indefinitely. We do know that they had done an appraisal as a part of the current discussions in the several-year process that the mayor has had with the National Guard to arrange for the possible acquisition of this piece of property. I do agree that it makes sense for the city to acquire it, irrespective of its future use, based on the beneficial valuation that the city would pay for it. But we don't know if, as a consequence of doing the appraisal and going through this process, if the city were not to acquire it, whether or not the National Guard might be motivated to go ahead with a market sale of the property. They had estimated the market value unrestricted at about $685,000, as I recall. And so they might be looking, if they're looking for revenue, they may look to sell it on the market. That's up to them, of course. But the city would get a preferential rate as a municipality, and for general municipal purposes, the purchase price would be only $220,000. So obviously the city would get a better rate. It's not clear to us whether the National Guard would, if the city doesn't acquire the property, would perhaps look to make some revenues that it might need in a challenging time. I would hope that's not the case, but like I said, I think that perhaps to your point, it does make sense for the city to take up that opportunity now for the Low Street property, irrespective of any decision relative to Low Street to use services. Do we have any other hands raised this evening? Anybody else who'd like to comment? Okay, with no other hands raised, this is Andy. I did want to thank everybody who's here this evening, especially Andy Egmont and her team who've worked on this project for a while, and the Studio MLA team. So we thank you for attending this evening, for hearing about the project. The presentation is on the website, and we'll make sure that the full feasibility study report is there as well. And so I'm sure there'll be future discussions about the Low Street property with the City Council and the Youth Services Program between the mayor, Youth Services, and the City Council about where to go moving forward. So thank you again for attending tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.